You know, it's easy to think that once Christianity became the dominant force in the late Roman Empire, pagan philosophy would have just, like, disappeared.
Right.
But that's actually not what happened at all.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this period so fascinating. Because even with the rise of Christianity, pagan philosophers continued to teach and study the core works of classical Greek philosophy.
Absolutely.
And in 6th century Alexandria, one of the key figures doing this was Olympiodorus.
Exactly. Olympiodorus of Alexandria. We know he was a late student of Ammonius Hermeo, the same Ammonius who was the teacher of other significant figures like Simplicius and John Philoponus.
Right.
So Olympiodorus was teaching Plato and Aristotle in the 6th century. And what's remarkable is we actually have several of his commentaries on their writings that are still with us today.
Interesting.
And it's worth noting that Ammonius himself was a really central figure in the Alexandrian Neoplatonist school, which tried to harmonize the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. So, understanding that lineage, I think, helps you, our listener, appreciate the intellectual context that Olympiodorus was working in.
That's a really good point. So this creates this kind of paradoxical situation then, right? Because although Olympiodorus' own philosophical ideas, maybe weren't as groundbreaking as some of his contemporaries, his work actually gives us this amazing viewpoint. It's like a window into how pagan philosophy was being taught to an audience that was primarily Christian at that point.
Yeah.
And I think understanding that dynamic, how these potentially conflicting ideas were being transmitted so carefully, gives us this crucial insight into how intellectual traditions actually survive and adapt under pressure.
Right.
And that's really what we're going to explore today.
Yeah, and we have commentaries by him on Plato's Alcibiades, Gorgias Phaedo, and then for Aristotle, we have commentaries on the categories and the meteorology. And we also have his prolegomena to Aristotle's logic. So that's quite a range of texts that he was engaging with, reflecting the breadth of classical philosophical study that was happening at the time.
So that really sets the stage for our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to try to understand Olympiodorus' role as a teacher in this, really dynamic intellectual landscape.
Yes.
We'll look at the content and style of his teaching, and ultimately what we want to do is uncover those unique insights that his commentaries offer into the intellectual life of late antiquity.
Okay.
Let's get started. Let's learn a little bit more about Olympiodorus' life and the world he lived in.
So there are three essential pieces of information that I think are really helpful in, forming a solid foundation.
Okay.
So first off, he held the chair of philosophy in Alexandria.
Wow.
So that was quite a prestigious position. Secondly, he very clearly identified himself as the intellectual successor to Ammonius.
Oh, interesting.
He refers to him constantly in his writings, even calls him our philosopher sometimes. And thirdly, we have evidence that at least some of his lectures took place after 565 CE.
Okay.
And there's a comment that he remembers that allows us to kind of push his active teaching career into his late 60s or early 70s.
Oh, wow.
Which would put his lifespan roughly, somewhere between 500 and 570 CE. So that makes him a contemporary of Justinian.
And Justinian's reign is a really important one here, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Justinian was making these very public efforts to suppress pagan philosophy. I mean, the most famous example of this is the closing of the Athenian school around 529.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there was still this real need for classical education, which included philosophy, especially among the elites. So how do these seemingly opposing forces work out in practice?
Well, what's so interesting is exactly this tension. I mean, even though Justinian was trying to eliminate pagan philosophy as a kind of religious or ideological rival to Christianity, the empire still relied heavily on classical learning in its intellectual and cultural life, and that included both the secular and the clerical spheres.
Right.
So training in things like logic and ontology, which are really fundamental parts of philosophy, that was essential for anyone who wanted to engage meaningfully in the theological debates that were happening at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially all the very complex arguments about the nature of Christ. So it's a bit of a paradox. Philosophical study not only persisted, but it actually thrived in places like Alexandria, even under an emperor who was actively trying to restrict it.
So Alexandria becomes this sort of fascinating intellectual hub.
It does, yeah.
And within that environment, I understand that Olympiodorus' audience was mainly Christian elites. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which must have had a huge impact on his teaching methods.
Absolutely. I mean, think about his situation in contrast to someone like Simplicius. After the Athenian school closed, Simplicius essentially didn't have a formal group of students anymore.
Right.
And that meant that he could express his philosophical views, perhaps with more conviction without having to worry so much about the sensitivities of his audience.
I see, yeah.
But Olympiodorus, on the other hand, he was speaking to students who had very different religious beliefs.
Right.
So their particular needs, their interests, what they expected from him, all of that would have really shaped what he taught and how he taught it.
Yeah.
He had to be more overtly pedagogical, more careful about how he approached sensitive religious issues.
So it sounds like he was walking a really fine line there.
He was, yeah.
So we have this image of this erudite pagan philosopher very carefully trying to share this classical wisdom with a mostly Christian audience. Let's talk a little bit about his teaching style and what he focused on in terms of content, starting with Plato. What was his main goal, do you think, when he was teaching Plato?
Well, his opening remarks in his commentary on Plato's Alcibiades are pretty telling, I think. He basically says, and this echoes Aristotle, by the way, but he applies it to Plato, that everyone desires Plato's philosophy because they're seeking to get something good out of it. So it seems like his aim was to show his audience that engaging with Plato, both his writings and his life, could actually be really beneficial. It could be part of their paideia, their education, and cultural development.
So it's not about seeing Plato as the source of ultimate truth anymore, right?
No.
It's about recognizing his work as this vital part of their shared cultural heritage.
Exactly.
Like, it's been described as like assembling Byzantine mosaic, giving them these elements of a classical education.
Right, that's a really important point. And you see this in the way that he constantly refers to things like Homer, Demosthenes, other orators and philosophers, even other Platonic dialogues that his students hadn't read yet.
Interesting.
He's deliberately pointing them towards this wider intellectual world.
Right.
And I think that's why he's been called the first classicist, because he was actively trying to preserve and transmit these texts as important cultural artifacts.
And he had a very specific structure for his classes, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Very formal methodology.
How did that work?
So each lecture session, what he called a praxis, was divided into 3 stages.
Okay.
There was an initial reading of the text, which he called lexis.
Okay.
Then there was a general overview of the passage, which was the theoria.
Okay.
And then finally, there was a more detailed and nuanced rereading, which was lexis again.
So Lexis Theoria. Lexis.
Exactly. And the theoria gave him a chance to offer sort of general insights into the meaning and significance of the passage, while the second lexis focused on more specific points like philological issues, linguistic points, logic, rhetoric, kind of like modern textual annotations, really.
Right, I see.
And this structure seems to be a development of the teaching methods that Proclus used before him.
Now, one thing that's really interesting is that Olympiodorus seems to have avoided talking directly about the truth or falsehood of philosophical claims when he was in the classroom,
Yeah.
which for a philosopher seems pretty unusual. Why do you think he did that?
It is intriguing. He seems to have treated truth in this kind of abstract way, often linking it to what he called common notions. And I think there are probably 2 reasons for this avoidance. One is that he probably wanted to avoid directly contradicting the Christian beliefs of his audience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the other reason might be that he just didn't think that was the best way to teach in that particular context. He was more focused on the value and the cultural importance of the texts themselves.
So even though he was being so careful, his commentaries still have these fascinating little asides, don't they?
Yeah.
It's like these unintentional historical glimpses into his time.
Right, exactly. Like, for example, he mentions that part of the original endowment of Plato's Academy in Athens might still have existed in his time, which is really interesting. He also talks about how an Alexandrian rhetorician cleverly adapted a line from Homer in 546, and it had a big impact. And then there's this really intriguing reference to an Orphic tradition that prohibited suicide because human bodies belong to Dionysus.
Oh, wow.
So all these seemingly small details actually give us these really valuable glimpses into the intellectual and cultural currents of that period.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And we even get some anecdotes about his teacher Ammonius, like the one about the tension between aristocracy and monarchy as forms of government.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So in his commentary on Plato's Gorgias, Olympiodorus argues that aristocracy is the best form of government. And he uses this analogy between the microcosm, the city or the human being, and the macrocosm, the universe.
Right.
And this analogy seems to point towards monarchy because there's this idea of a single divine ruler of the universe.
Yeah.
But when someone points out this apparent contradiction, Olympiodorus tells the story about how Ammonius cleverly responded to the same issue.
Oh, what did he say?
He said, "Give him the knuckles and praise him, for it is the same. Even if there are many exceedingly good people, they form a living unit, for they have everything in common." So it's this clever way of reconciling these seemingly opposing viewpoints. And it also shows us the kind of intellectual flexibility that was valued within their philosophical tradition.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've talked about this balancing act that he had to perform. Let's talk more specifically about how he navigated the inherent tensions between paganism and the dominant Christianity of his audience. How did he handle that?
Well, that's a really key aspect of understanding his work for sure. The Delphic oracle still had some reputation at that time, but we see Olympiodorus frequently omitting or replacing the names of Greek gods, especially Zeus, with the more generic term god when he's quoting Plato.
Interesting.
So it seems like he was wrestling with this challenge of how to explain these pagan divinities in a way that would make sense to his Christian students.
Yeah.
And he suggests that they shouldn't be bothered by names like, power of Cronus or power of Zeus. Instead, they should focus on the underlying concepts.
I see.
And he even suggests that maybe these powers could be interpreted as intellectual and vital forces that come from the ultimate first cause, which would align more with a monotheistic framework.
So it's a way of sort of reinterpreting or assimilating these pagan ideas into a more monotheistic framework.
Right, exactly.
And we actually see his students asking him directly about this stuff, don't we?
Yeah, we do. There are moments where these tensions really come to the surface. Like in one lecture on the Gorgias, he's trying to reassure his students that they shouldn't take pagan myths literally. He's saying that they were just a typical part of ancient Greek discourse.
Okay.
But then a student who's clearly not totally convinced by this allegorical approach challenges him about whether philosophers can be trusted at all, since they often disagree with each other. And Olympiodorus' response is kind of indirect. He emphasizes the importance of relying on common notions in philosophy, but also suggests that myths need some explanation before they can be understood.
So it seems like he was constantly having to navigate this tricky intellectual landscape. And it's interesting that his students, even though they were wary of paganism, they were also kind of fascinated by its darker side.
That's right. It's like they're drawn to it even as they're a bit afraid of it.
Yeah.
So when Socrates mentions the Salian witches in the Gorgias, Olympiodorus at first just gives a brief explanation. But his students clearly wanted more.
Of course, who wouldn't?
Right. So he starts the next lecture by acknowledging their interest in this popular belief that wizards could draw down the moon during a lunar eclipse. And he also talks about the practice of beating on bronze instruments during an eclipse, which was supposed to ward off evil. He explains these customs by talking about these wandering infernal demons that were thought to be active during the darkness of an eclipse. And he says that the bronze beating was a way to scare them off, apotropaic practices, as they're called. He even explicitly says, "I have dealt with these things because you are not without ideas about these customs."
So he's acknowledging that his students are already thinking about these things, even if it's not strictly philosophical.
Exactly. And it shows us the kind of cultural environment they were living in and the kinds of questions they were grappling with.
Yeah, that's a really vivid picture of what was going on in those classrooms.
It is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how Olympiodorus approached Aristotle. Were his teaching style and the things he emphasized similar to how he taught Plato?
Well, we see similar introductory statements in his Aristotle commentaries. Like in his Prolegomena to Aristotle's Logic, he talks about the fountain of good things to be found in Aristotle's philosophy and how it can lead the mind to precision. The Prolegomena itself gives this concise overview of different Greek philosophical schools, how Aristotle's works are organized, the main goal of his philosophy, which he says is identifying the good as the unmoved mover.
Right.
And he also talks about what qualities students and teachers of philosophy should have.
Interesting.
But, just like with Plato, he avoids directly evaluating different philosophical viewpoints or talking about whether Plato and Aristotle can be reconciled.
So he's sticking to that same approach.
He is, yeah. It seems to have been a conscious decision.
And his understanding of Aristotle's categories seems to be in line with the dominant thinking of the Alexandrian school, right?
Yes, that's right. He adopts Iamblichus's view that the subject matter of the categories is discourse, signifying things through mental concepts.
Okay.
And in terms of structure, his commentary on the categories is actually simpler. It mostly consists of theoriae, unlike his meteorology commentary, which follows that more typical three-part structure of Praxagoras subdivided into theoriae and lexias.
Now, the meteorology commentary is particularly important, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's the only complete ancient commentary that we have on Aristotle's meteorology.
Wow.
John Philoponus, who was working in the same intellectual circle, also wrote a commentary, but it's incomplete. Olympiodorus starts his commentary by going straight into Aristotle's text, placing it within the context of Aristotle's other works on natural philosophy, like the Physics and De Caelo. And he mostly sticks to a pretty orthodox Aristotelian perspective.
In what way?
Well, he affirms the existence of the five elements, including aether as this creative celestial element, and he also supports the idea of the eternity of the universe and time without any of the qualifications that you might expect given the Christian doctrines of the time.
So he's not really trying to reconcile those two viewpoints.
Not explicitly, no.
Now, one thing that's really striking is that he never mentions John Philoponus, even though Philoponus had some major criticisms of Aristotle and they were both working in the same intellectual environment. It almost seems deliberate, like he's trying to ignore him.
It does, doesn't it? It's quite remarkable. He often cites Alexander of Aphrodisias and draws heavily on Ammonius's views. But Philoponus, not a word.
Wow.
He sometimes refers to unnamed people whose views he disagrees with, but it's hard to say for sure if those are Philoponus's views.
Right.
So this strongly suggests that he was deliberately leaving out a major intellectual figure of his time, someone he probably knew personally.
Yeah.
It seems like Philoponus was a bit of a persona non grata for Olympiodorus and his circle, just like he was for Simplicius in Athens.
Interesting.
And it shows you how even within the philosophical community there were these internal boundaries and disagreements, even as the broader culture was undergoing these huge transformations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, there's also this interesting question of whether Olympiodorus was involved in alchemy.
Oh, yeah, that's a curious one. So there's an alchemical work that's attributed to someone called Olympiodorus, the Alexandrian philosopher.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be a commentary on a treatise by Zosimus called On Activity. This alchemical text is all about things like the purification of metals, this mysterious substance called divine water. And it refers to pre-Socratic philosophers and other important figures in the history of alchemy. But what's really interesting is that it doesn't seem to be very familiar with the works of Plato and Aristotle, which is a bit odd for a philosopher, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. So naturally, there's been a lot of debate about whether this is actually our Olympiodorus. I mean, the idea of him being a Christian alchemist just doesn't seem very likely.
Right. Most scholars, including big names like H.D. Safry, argue that the philosopher didn't write this alchemical work. They point out that the text has Christian references, which the philosopher as a pagan wouldn't have made.
Right.
And they also say that the content, the style, the whole tone of the alchemical treatise is very different from his philosophical writing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But there's another scholar, Civiano, who has a different perspective.
Oh, interesting.
She points to some structural and linguistic similarities between the alchemical treatise and Olympiodorus's commentary on Book 4 of Aristotle's Meteorology. And she suggests that maybe the philosopher did write part of the alchemical work, and then it was later expanded or compiled by someone else.
So it's possible that it's kind of a mix of his work and someone else's.
Exactly.
So regardless of whether he actually wrote the whole thing or not, the fact that this alchemical work is attributed to him tells us something about his influence in late antiquity, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Even if he didn't write the whole alchemical text, the fact that it's connected to his name shows that he was a significant figure in the intellectual landscape of that period.
Okay, so lastly, let's talk about his direct influence and legacy. Did his teaching have a lasting impact on later philosophical thought?
Well, he definitely had students who went on to become philosophers themselves, like David and Elias, for instance. They adopted his teaching methods with the Theoriae and Lexis, and they actually acknowledge him in their own writing. And there's also Stephanus of Alexandria, who taught in Constantinople in the early 7th century, who seems to have been influenced by him too.
Okay.
But his broader influence beyond his immediate students is a bit harder to trace.
Right.
It's not as clear-cut as some other Alexandrian thinkers. His works were known to some extent in Syriac and Arabic intellectual circles, but he wasn't widely read in the Latin West.
I see.
And even the survival of his manuscript commentaries is patchy. Most of them are pretty rare, except for his commentary on Plato's Phaedo, which is more common.
Interesting.
And we also know that he must have written other works that haven't survived.
Like what?
Commentaries on Porphyry's Introduction and several of Aristotle's works, like the Analytics, the Generatione e Corruptione de Anima. He also planned to give lectures on Plato's Sophist, but none of that material has survived.
So Olympiodorus is this really crucial figure for us if we want to understand how classical philosophy was transmitted and adapted in a Christian context in late antiquity.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
His teaching techniques, the specific content he chose to focus on, and even the mysteries surrounding that alchemical text, all of that contributes to this fascinating picture of a very learned individual navigating this complex intellectual environment.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, I think this deep dive gives you a really unique perspective on how philosophical traditions change and survive as the cultural landscape shifts around them. It shows you the enduring power of Plato and Aristotle, even when their works are being interpreted through these new cultural and religious lenses.
Yeah.
You've gained some real insight into the challenges and the creative strategies involved in teaching philosophy in a world that's undergoing this profound intellectual changes.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to consider. Think about this tension that we've been talking about between wanting to preserve classical knowledge and needing to adapt it to contemporary worldviews. How would a modern-day Olympiodorus deal with these same challenges in our own world, where we're bombarded with information and everything is constantly changing? What gets saved, what gets reinterpreted, and what ultimately gets left behind? It's a question worth pondering.